Cole Mercer stood in an abandoned container yard choked with weeds, rust, and the thick smell of old oil when the auctioneer's gavel struck for the final time. $100. The crowd laughed. Tyler Knox shook his head and said, loud enough for the people near him to hear, "You didn't buy land, Cole. You bought a cleanup bill." Claire Vaughn, a CEO who had come through the area on an industrial land survey and had wandered into the liquidation sale out of professional habit, looked at the container lot for no more than 3 seconds before saying, to no one in particular, "Some men mistake garbage for opportunity." Cole said nothing. He bent down, pulled a rusted padlock from the mud at his feet, and let his eyes move slowly across the hundreds of empty containers stretching toward the gray horizon. 6 years later, the same people who had laughed would be lining up outside his gates. How does a $100 container yard that everyone called a cleanup bill become a multi-million-dollar empire? This is that story. The auction took place on a Tuesday morning in early November, held at a decommissioned freight terminal on the southern edge of Caldwell County, roughly 2 miles from the nearest federal highway. The county port authority had been slowly liquidating its surplus assets for years. Broken forklifts, outdated dock machinery, hydraulic lift systems that no longer lifted, and this particular morning, the last major lot had come up for bid. A sprawling container yard covering just under 4 acres, home to several hundred steel shipping containers that had sat idle since the terminal closed. The land itself was technically leased from the county. The containers were legally abandoned. The infrastructure connecting them, corroded pipes, a non-functional electrical grid, a chain-link fence that had mostly collapsed, was classified in the county's books as a liability rather than an asset. Nobody in the crowd of about 40 real estate speculators, industrial scrap dealers, and idle curiosity seekers had come to buy it. Most had shown up to watch it get written off. Cole Mercer arrived in a faded blue pickup truck with close to 200,000 miles on the odometer, wearing a canvas jacket with a torn left pocket and work boots that had been resoled twice. He was 38 years old. 14 months earlier, his small freight brokerage had collapsed under a combination of lost contracts, rising fuel costs, and a debt restructuring that ended in a bankruptcy filing. His credit score sat somewhere below 500. Every bank within 60 miles had turned him down for a business loan, including Brooke Ellis at First Continental, who had declined twice with the kind of careful sympathy that made rejection feel professionally appropriate. He had no investors, no partners, no safety net, and no plan that could be presented in a conference room without someone asking him to leave. The people who knew him assumed he had come to the auction to watch or to network, or simply because he had nowhere else useful to be. They were wrong, but there was no way of knowing that yet. Tyler Knox was there. Tyler owned a mid-sized logistics firm in the county seat, had 3 trucks and a warehouse, and considered himself the authority on what was and was not worth acquiring in a 50-mile radius. He spotted Cole near the back of the crowd and gave him a nod that contained just enough condescension to be deliberate. Tyler had hired Cole's brokerage 2 years prior, paid late, disputed the invoice, and ultimately paid half. He had never apologized. Cole had never forgotten. Claire Vaughn had not planned to attend the auction at all. She was in the area surveying industrial properties for Vaughn Industrial Group, the supply chain and warehousing company she had built into one of the region's most respected logistics operations. And a colleague had mentioned the liquidation sale only in passing. She arrived late, stood near the edge of the crowd in a wool coat, and looked at the container yard with the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated 1,000 deals and could recognize, almost instantly, which ones were not worth her time. The bidding moved quickly through the smaller lots, and then the auctioneer reached the last item on his list. He described the container yard in flat, bureaucratic language. 4 acres on county-leased land, approximately 240 steel shipping containers in various states of condition, Electrical grid non-operational. Water access via a disconnected municipal line. No current zoning restrictions beyond standard industrial classification. He started the bidding at $500. Silence. He dropped to $250. More silence. He dropped to $100. The crowd stirred. Someone muttered that even $100 was too much. Then Cole raised his hand. For a beat, nobody responded. Then the auctioneer said, "Sold," with the flat tone of a man who had seen stranger things, and the gavel came down. The laughter came immediately after. Not cruel exactly, but unguarded, the kind that escapes a crowd when something absurd has just become real. Tyler was the first to speak. "You didn't buy land, Cole. You bought a cleanup bill." Claire said nothing to Cole directly, but she turned to the colleague beside her and said quietly, "Some men mistake garbage for opportunity." Cole heard it. He did not respond. Warren Hale, who managed commercial property filings for the county and had processed the sale paperwork himself, walked over to Cole while the crowd dispersed. Warren was not unkind. He simply could not reconcile what he was observing with any version of a rational plan. He asked Cole, genuinely and without malice, whether he actually knew what he had just purchased. Cole looked out at the rows of rusted containers half swallowed by waist-high grass, their doors caked with grime, their sides streaked orange with age and rain. Then he said, without looking away from the yard, "Not entirely. But I know what everyone else just walked past." Warren filed the paperwork. Cole pulled out the back of the auction receipt, a crumpled half-sheet of carbon paper, and began to draw. Not a business plan, not a financial model, just a rough sketch of the yard's dimensions and the arrangement of the containers and the points where a truck could enter and exit. He worked until the light was nearly gone, then folded the paper into his jacket pocket and began to walk the perimeter of everything he now owned. The morning after the auction, Cole arrived before sunrise with bolt cutters, a borrowed chainsaw, 2 gallons of water, a bag of tools, and no one to help him. What he found in full daylight was worse than the fading afternoon light had suggested. The electrical panel near the eastern gate had been stripped of its copper years ago. The main water shutoff was corroded completely closed and would need a plumber to free it. The chain-link fencing along 3 sides of the property had partially collapsed, fallen outward into the adjacent access road in several places. The padlocks on at least 60 containers were fused by rust, and a further 30 had doors so warped by moisture and ground shifting that they would not open under normal force. The weeds growing between the container rows had reached waist height in the denser sections, and in 2 places near the rear of the lot, young trees had begun to push through gaps in the pavement. None of this surprised him. Surprise required expectations he had not permitted himself. He started with the fence because there was nothing productive he could accomplish inside the yard while the perimeter was open. He spent the first 3 days pulling up collapsed sections, driving new posts where the old ones had rotted out, and running wire with a staple gun and whatever hardware he could salvage from the bins inside the dead maintenance shed. He had not told anyone beyond a vague mention to his neighbor that he was working on a project. The few people in his life who might have asked directly had not asked, because most of them had quietly stopped expecting much from Cole Mercer after the bankruptcy. Brooke Ellis at First Continental received his application for a small improvement loan in the first week, enough to bring in a crew for basic site cleanup, reviewed the file carefully, and declined. Not without sympathy. The property was leased rather than owned. The collateral was insufficient, and his credit history made underwriting impossible. Cole thanked her and left. 3 days later, Tyler Knox happened to drive past the yard on his way to a county commerce meeting, saw Cole bent over a section of fencing with wire cutters and a pair of pliers, slowed down, rolled his window down, and called out, "Still waiting for your empire to arrive." Cole looked up, measured the distance, and went back to the wire. The money for the first real cleanup came from scrap. Cole identified which containers were damaged beyond practical use: split seams, collapsed roofs, floors rotted through from years of trapped moisture, and sold the steel to a recycling yard 40 miles away. It took 6 trips in the pickup and roughly 3 weeks, but it generated enough to pay for electrical reconnection, a used pressure washer, and 2 weeks of part-time labor from a man named Dale, who worked odd jobs around the county and did not ask many questions. Together they cut the weeds, cleared the access lanes, freed the stuck container doors, and pressure washed the exteriors of the front 2 rows until the containers looked, if not new, at least operational. On a Thursday evening in the 3rd week, Nolan showed up at the gate with a paper bag containing 2 sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. He was quiet by nature and did not make a production of the visit. He sat on the pickup's front bumper and watched his father work for a while before asking, in the offhand way of someone who already knew the answer was not simple, why Cole hadn't just walked away. Cole put down the wrench he was holding, looked at the yard, still rough, still far from finished, but beginning to have the faint geometry of something intentional, and said, "Because abandoned things only stay abandoned if nobody claims them." Nolan handed him a sandwich. They ate without talking, and the yard was quiet around them, except for the wind moving through the hollow steel. Cole slept in the truck cab the first 2 nights when he worked late, unwilling to leave the unattended yard after dark. On the 3rd morning, with the fence solid and the access lanes clear and the first row of containers clean and accessible, he found a piece of scrap plywood in the maintenance shed, painted it white with an exterior can he found on a shelf, and lettered it in black with a wide-tipped marker. He drove 2 steel stakes through the bottom edge and hammered it into the ground beside the front gate. It read in uneven but legible letters, "Mercer Container Yard, Storage, Repairs, and Second Chances." He stepped back, looked at it for a moment longer than he intended to, then went back to work. The plan Cole had sketched on the back of the auction receipt that first evening was not, at its core, a storage business. He had thought about storage. It was the obvious first move, the thing any reasonable person would reach for when confronted with 240 empty containers in a fenced industrial lot. But Cole had spent 14 months thinking carefully about why small freight and logistics operations failed, and storage alone was not the answer he kept arriving at. The answer was space. Not the kind of space that came with a commercial lease in a business complex, with monthly rates designed for established companies and requirements that included credit history, insurance minimums, and long-term commitments. The kind of space that a mechanic with a 2-bay shop could rent for 3 months while he figured out if he had enough customers to justify a 3rd bay. The kind of space that a food truck owner could use as a commissary kitchen without signing a 12-month contract. The kind of space that a small construction company could use for equipment storage between jobs without paying for square footage they didn't need on the days they didn't need it. Cole divided the yard into zones. The first zone at the front nearest the gate was basic enclosed storage, containers rented by the month at rates well below what the self-storage facilities in town charged. The second zone, along the widened central lane, was configured for working access. Containers rented to independent mechanics, welders, and woodworkers who needed a place to operate without the overhead of a commercial lease. He cut ventilation panels into the roofs, installed basic electrical outlets powered by the reconnected grid, and added lighting strips to the interiors. The third zone, along the rear fence, was reserved for refrigerated units, containers retrofitted with second-hand cooling systems for small restaurants and food producers who needed cold storage without the cost of a dedicated refrigeration facility. Along the southern edge, he kept a stretch of open lane wide enough for a semi-truck to back in, available by the hour for mobile repair operations. The people he pitched the idea to reacted in roughly the same way every time. They listened, nodded slowly, and then asked some version of the same question. How was this different from a junkyard with extra services? Cole stopped trying to rebrand it and started letting the prices speak instead. Naomi Pierce, who covered local business and economic development for the county's weekly paper, had heard about the auction from a colleague and had been vaguely tracking Cole's activity from a distance. She drove out to the yard on a slow Wednesday afternoon and spent 2 hours walking the property with Cole, who showed her the zones and explained the pricing model and described what he intended to add. Naomi had covered enough small business stories to recognize when something was genuinely different from merely being unusual, and this felt like both. She asked Cole what he wanted people to understand about what he was doing. He thought about it for a moment and said, "Small businesses don't need skyscrapers. They need space they can afford." She wrote it down. It ended up as the pull quote in the piece she ran the following Thursday. Claire Vaughn read that article on her phone on a Friday morning between 2 other items in her news briefing. She read it once, set the phone down, thought about it briefly, and dismissed it. The model was too small to be strategic. Tyler Knox read the same article and reached the same conclusion. Cole Mercer was a bankrupt freight broker playing yard manager. It was either sad or admirable, depending on your perspective, but it was not competition. What neither of them registered was the quiet arithmetic of what Cole was building. Each container that went from empty to occupied was a fixed asset converted to recurring revenue. Each satisfied tenant became word of mouth that reached 3 or 4 other small operators looking for exactly the same thing, and each dollar above operating costs went straight back into the yard. There were no pitch decks, no investor presentations, no press events. There was only the arithmetic, grinding forward, and Cole Mercer at the center of it. The baker was the moment that stayed with him. A woman named Ruth, who had run a small specialty bread business out of a commercial kitchen she rented from a local restaurant. The restaurant sold. The new owners wanted the kitchen back, and Ruth had been 3 weeks from shutting down entirely when she heard about the refrigerated storage at Mercer Yard. She came in on a Saturday, looked at the container, asked the monthly rate, and quietly started to cry, her hand over her mouth, as though she hadn't planned to, when she realized she could afford it. She thanked Cole 4 times before she left. He told her the first month was free while she got set up. He hadn't planned to offer that. It came out before he thought about it. That afternoon, he sat in his truck for 10 minutes before he could make himself start the engine and drive home. He had 7 paying tenants by the end of the 2nd month. It was not yet enough to cover everything, but it was enough to make the concept visible to anyone who cared to look. 6 years is a long time when you are building something alone, and a short time when you look back and try to understand how the distance was covered. The first year was the hardest, not because the physical work was heaviest. The work would always be heavy, but because there was so little outward evidence that any of it was working. Cole had 14 tenants by the end of year 1, had cleared the last of his scrap metal debt, reconnected all the utilities, and repaired nearly every container in the yard to at least functional condition. He had not taken a salary. He was still sleeping in the house he rented on the east side of the county, driving the same pickup, eating the same way he had been eating since the bankruptcy. But the yard was alive in a way it had not been the day he bought it, and that felt, in the absence of anything else, like legitimate progress. By the 2nd year, the mechanics section had expanded from 3 containers to 11. 2 independent welders had joined. A small auto body operation was using the open southern lane 4 days a week. Cole added a security camera system using equipment from an electronics distributor liquidation sale, wired it himself over 2 weekends, and installed a keypad entry at the main gate. The 3rd year brought the refrigerated logistics expansion. Demand had grown steadily as local food producers, small restaurant groups, and a regional farmers cooperative heard about the yard through the network of small operators who worked there. Cole acquired 8 additional refrigerated containers through a shuttered grocery chain's liquidation sale, retrofitted them across one summer, and tripled the cold storage capacity of the yard in a single season. By year 4, Nolan had built a management system for the operation, starting as a simple database to replace the spiral notebook Cole kept in the truck cab, then expanding until the software tracked container availability in real time, generated monthly statements automatically, logged maintenance requests, and flagged vacant containers so Cole could reach out to prospective tenants. It was the first time since the bankruptcy that Cole felt something like leverage, the sense that the yard could now operate at a scale where his own 2 hands were no longer the ceiling. Year 5 was the year of contracts. Not the small month-to-month arrangements that had sustained the early growth, but longer commitments from larger regional operators. A building materials company needing overflow warehousing, a trucking firm needing secure staging space for high-value freight, a cold chain food distributor that signed a 12-month agreement for a block of refrigerated containers. Cole brought in 2 full-time staff members and started paying himself a modest salary for the first time. He also installed a rooftop solar array across the front section's containers, which cut the yard's electricity costs by more than half and made the operation genuinely profitable at a level that would have seemed implausible 4 years earlier. By the end of year 6, Mercer Container Yard covered the original 4-acre lease, plus an adjacent 2-acre parcel Cole had negotiated from the county the previous spring. It had more than 180 tenants. It employed 11 people directly and supported, by rough count, another 67 small business operations that relied on its storage, workspace, and cold chain infrastructure. Naomi had been updating her original profile piece annually, each version adding another layer to the story of a yard that refused to stay small. Cole had been offered 2 podcast interviews and declined both. He did not particularly want to be a story. He wanted to run a yard. Through all of it, he kept the padlock, the rusted one he had pulled from the mud on the afternoon of the auction, the one that had been his only souvenir of that day's strange optimism. It hung on a nail just inside the door of the small container that served as his office, the original one, the first container he had cleaned and wired and turned into a working space in the second week of ownership. He had been offered nicer arrangements more than once. He had stayed. And on the afternoon the 6th year ended, when a convoy of dark SUVs rolled slowly up the access road and stopped at the main gate of Mercer Container Yard, Cole was at his desk reviewing a maintenance log, with the padlock visible on the wall behind him. The convoy belonged to Vaughn Industrial Group, and the woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle was Claire Vaughn herself, which told Cole something significant about whatever had brought her here. Claire did not make personal visits to properties she was merely assessing. She sent people for that. The fact that she had come in person, unannounced and without a prior call, meant that whatever was happening on her side had developed faster than a normal business process could accommodate. The situation had been building for more than a year. Vaughn Industrial Group operated 3 large warehouse facilities in the region, all of them traditional fixed infrastructure operations designed for the kind of consistent, high-volume freight flows that had characterized the supply chain before recent disruptions reshaped the landscape. Those flows had changed. Large retail clients were moving toward smaller, faster, more distributed inventory models. Demand for inflexible, large-footprint storage was down. 3 of Vaughn's anchor contracts had either not been renewed or had been significantly reduced. And Tyler Knox, who had been providing supplementary logistics services to Vaughn on a subcontracting basis, had delivered 2 consecutive quarters of missed delivery windows, misrouted freight, and, as Claire had recently discovered, billing irregularities that amounted to charging for services that had not been rendered. Claire had begun looking at alternative models, and Mercer Container Yard had appeared in her team's regional analysis in a way that surprised her. Not as a marginal oddity, but as a hub, the entity through which a significant portion of the region's small business logistics activity was now quietly flowing, without anyone at the large firms having noticed. The refrigerated containers were running at full capacity. The workspace sections had a wait list. 3 mid-sized regional companies were using Mercer as overflow storage for peak demand periods. The whole thing had grown into something that, by any objective standard, was functioning more efficiently than it should have been. Cole received her in the small container office, offered her a chair, and waited. Claire had developed, over her career, a considerable command of the opening move in a negotiation, the reframing statement, the compliment with an edge, the gesture toward mutual benefit that concealed the power differential without eliminating it. She used none of those tools with Cole. She looked around the office, at the operational monitors Nolan had installed along one wall, at the maintenance logs on the desk, at the padlock on the nail. Then she told him, directly, that Vaughn Industrial was facing structural challenges, and that she believed Mercer's model represented a solution to some of them. She wanted to discuss an acquisition. Cole listened without interrupting. The offer Claire named was real money, generous, carefully structured, the kind of number that would have solved every financial problem he had accumulated since the bankruptcy, and left him in a fundamentally different relationship to risk for the rest of his working life. She presented it without hedging, which he found he respected. He looked at the number on the paper she slid across the desk. He looked at the padlock on the wall. He looked at the occupancy indicator on the operational board, which at that moment was showing 100% for the refrigerated section. Then he slid the paper back. Claire looked at him. She said, in a tone that was more bewildered than offended, "You understand what this could mean for you." Cole said, "It already happened, 6 years ago." There was a pause. He added, more quietly, "What you're describing would change Vaughn's situation." That's not the same thing. Claire left the meeting without the agreement she had come for, but with an expression that had shifted from assessment posture into something that looked, for the first time, like genuine curiosity about who Cole Mercer actually was. Tyler Knox learned about the visit within a week. His source was a contact at the county commerce office, and the information reached him at a Chamber of Commerce dinner. Claire Vaughn had personally toured Mercer Container Yard and had come back without a deal. Tyler processed this the way he processed most competitive information, immediately and in terms of threat. He had spent 6 years treating Cole as a non-entity. The idea that Claire Vaughn had gone out to look at what Cole built and had returned without buying, it was not something he could hold at arm's length. It required a response. He began making calls to county zoning officials, framing his inquiries around compliance and regulatory consistency for non-standard industrial operations. He reviewed the original auction paperwork and the county lease terms. He talked to his own legal advisors about the liability landscape of a mixed-use industrial property operating under a month-to-month lease with a large number of individual tenants. He was not yet doing anything overt. He was identifying pressure points. And he was doing it quickly, because the only reason a man in Cole's position would turn down a very large check was if he believed what he was sitting on was worth more than the check. Tyler did not intend to let Cole be right about that. Tyler Knox moved fast, which was both his greatest professional advantage and, ultimately, his most revealing characteristic. He filed 3 separate inquiries with the county zoning office within a 2-week period, each framed as a general concern about noncompliance in the industrial corridor, each containing enough specific detail about Mercer Container Yard to make the actual target unmistakable. He alleged that the yard was operating as a de facto industrial park without proper commercial classification, that its mixed-use tenant arrangement violated the terms of the county lease, and that its food storage operations required a separate inspection certification that had not been obtained. None of the allegations was entirely fabricated. Each contained a kernel of genuine regulatory ambiguity, the inevitable result of a business model that had grown faster than its owner had been able to formalize every compliance detail. The first consequence, Cole felt, was a letter from the county zoning office informing him that a compliance review had been initiated. The letter arrived on a Monday. By Wednesday, his largest freight staging client had called to say their legal team was recommending they pause their contract while the compliance question was unresolved. The loss of that contract alone would not close the yard, but it would eliminate a significant portion of the revenue covering the expanded staff and the solar maintenance. Tyler's second move was more sophisticated. Through the same contact who had relayed the news about Claire's visit, he had located references to two outstanding debt instruments from Cole's original bankruptcy, small business loans that had been sold off during the restructuring and had ended up in a holding company. Tyler acquired the holding company, giving him legal standing to accelerate the repayment schedule. The amount was not enormous by commercial standards, perhaps $60,000 in principal and accrued interest, but the timing was designed to destabilize. If Cole had to direct operating cash toward debt service at the same moment his largest client was pausing and the county was conducting a compliance review, the arithmetic of the yard would tip toward crisis. Brooke Ellis at First Continental was the first to see the shape of what was happening. She had been tracking Mercer's account since Cole opened it, and when she saw the notification of the debt acceleration, she pulled the original loan files and found a procedural irregularity in how the loans had been packaged and sold. The transfer to the holding company might not have been fully executed under proper notice. It was not a definitive finding, but it was enough to pause enforcement while a legal review was conducted, which bought time. She called Cole's attorney without calling Cole directly because she did not want to raise expectations she couldn't guarantee. But she made the call. Naomi Pierce had been tracking the zoning complaint filings through public records as part of her regular beat, and when she saw the volume and specificity of inquiries directed at Mercer Container Yard, she began to ask questions. Her first calls went to the county zoning office, where she confirmed that all three complaints had come from a single filing entity. Her second calls went to the county clerk's records division, where she traced the entity back to a law firm that primarily represented Tyler Knox's logistics operation. Her third call went to Cole, who told her what he knew without embellishment, and asked her to give him a few days before she published. She agreed to 48 hours. What Cole had not anticipated was the response from within the yard itself. He had not told his tenants about the compliance review, partly to avoid alarming them, and partly because he believed the situation was still manageable. But information moved quickly through the network of small operators who worked there daily, and by the end of the first week, several tenants had come to his office individually. Gary the mechanic, Cole's second-ever tenant, who had moved his one-person shop into a container in year one and now ran a three-man operation with a fourth container for parts storage, came in with a folder of documents he had researched himself. Two precedents from neighboring counties where similar mixed-use industrial yards had been reclassified to commercial industrial hybrid zoning through an administrative process that required updated documentation rather than new permits. He set the folder on Cole's desk and said, "You've been letting us work here for 6 years. Let us work with you now." Ruth organized a meeting of all the yard's tenants. 43 people showed up. They came as a group to the county commerce office the following week. each with a written statement about what their access to Mercer Container Yard had meant for their survival or growth. Claire Vaughn heard about the tenant mobilization from two sources simultaneously. Naomi's article, which ran under the headline, "Who is really behind the Mercer complaint?" and a call from a senior contact at the county commerce office who considered the tenant statements politically significant in ways he wanted her to understand. Claire had been watching the situation develop with the careful attention she gave to circumstances where her own name was adjacent to someone else's misconduct. Tyler Knox had used Vaughn Industrial's supply chain distress as the opening through which to insert himself into the Mercer situation, and Claire was now in the position of having been, however inadvertently, a precondition for Tyler's scheme to operate. That was not a position she intended to hold. She called her legal team. Then she called a county council member she had worked with on a previous infrastructure project. Then she gave Naomi a statement on the record. And on the morning of the council hearings scheduled to review the Mercer Container Yard compliance question, Claire Vaughn arrived in the council chamber without Tyler Knox, sat on the opposite side of the room from where his attorney was seated, and waited for the session to begin. The county council chamber held perhaps 120 seats and was, on most weeks, occupied by fewer than 20. The morning of the Mercer hearing, every seat was filled, and another 40 people stood along the back wall. The overflow was not accidental. Gary had sent a message through the tenant network the night before. Ruth had posted a notice on the board inside the yard. By 9:15 in the morning, the room held everyone Cole had ever rented space to, and a substantial number of people who had never met Cole Mercer but had read about him and had arrived with opinions about what kind of county they wanted to live in. Tyler Knox's attorney opened with a prepared statement that ran 7 minutes, characterizing Mercer Container Yard as an unregulated junkyard operating outside its permitted use classification, creating liability exposure for the county, and undermining the competitive stability of the regional commercial real estate market. The statement was well-structured, legally coherent, and used the phrase regulatory clarity 4 times. Tyler sat behind his attorney with his hands folded on the table and the expression of a man who had done his legal homework. Naomi Pierce presented a documented report compiled over 2 weeks with assistance from a data analyst. She had pulled employment figures. The yard directly employed 11 people and hosted business operations that collectively employed an estimated 67 additional workers in the county. She had pulled tax records showing that businesses operating from Mercer Container Yard had contributed more than $400,000 in county sales and property-related tax revenue over the previous fiscal year. She had obtained written statements from 15 of those businesses: mechanics, food producers, woodworkers, small freight operators, describing what the yard's accessible pricing had meant for their ability to remain open. She had also obtained, through a public records request, communication records showing that Tyler Knox's filing entity had submitted all 3 zoning complaints within a 14-day window, and that 2 of them contained language lifted nearly verbatim from a memo written by Tyler's logistics firm's operations director. Brooke Ellis testified briefly about the debt instruments Tyler had acquired, noting that her bank's legal team had identified procedural irregularities in the transfer process that were currently under formal review, and that the enforcement action was on hold pending that outcome. She did not editorialize. She stated facts. The facts arranged themselves into a picture the council members could read without assistance. When Cole's turn came, he did not present financial models or projections. He stood, thanked the council for their time, and said that Mercer Container Yard had started as a $100 purchase of something everyone else had decided to discard, and that the only plan he had ever had was to create the kind of space where a person who was getting started, or getting back up, could afford to operate. He said he had not set out to build a logistics hub or a commercial real estate empire. He had set out to run a useful yard. The yard was, by any measure he knew how to apply, useful. Then he sat down. Claire Vaughn stood during the public comment period without having been called and identified herself for the record. She said that 6 years ago she had stood in this county and looked at Cole Mercer's property and seen garbage. She said she had spent 6 years building a large logistics business using conventional methods and had spent the last several months watching it struggle with structural problems that Mercer's model had never developed. She said, looking directly at the council, 6 years ago I saw garbage. Today I see the smartest logistics model in this state. She sat down without looking at Tyler Knox. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not. The council voted to grant a hybrid commercial industrial zoning classification to Mercer Container Yard under an expedited administrative process, extended the county land lease for an additional 15 years, and opened a formal inquiry into the conduct surrounding the complaint filings. Tyler Knox left the chamber before the vote was read into the record. His attorney followed. Several of the contracts Tyler had been holding with regional logistics clients did not survive the week, as Naomi's reporting circulated, and 2 of those clients began making inquiries of their own into what their subcontractor had been doing with county administrative channels. Cole stood in the parking lot after the session ended and received what felt like half the county coming to shake his hand. Gary pumped his arm twice and said nothing, which was eloquent. Ruth pressed a paper bag into his hands. Inside was a small loaf of bread with a handwritten note that said, simply, "Thank you for the first month." A reporter from the Regional Business Journal caught Cole near his truck and asked the question she had clearly been building toward for some time. She asked what he called what he had built. Was it a container yard, a logistics company, an industrial park? Cole looked out across the parking lot toward the road leading back to the yard, where he knew the lights were on and the tenants were working, and the system Nolan had built was tracking it all with quiet precision. He said, "I call it a place where people who got turned away can start again." The reporter wrote it down. The room behind him, still audible through the open-chambered doors, was still applauding. Mercer Container Yard became Mercer Modular Logistics in the spring of the 7th year, not because Cole had been planning the rename, he had not, but because 3 separate entities that wanted to formalize partnership arrangements had asked, in separate conversations, whether the business had a name that more accurately described what it had become. Cole spent about a week resisting the idea, then asked Nolan what he thought. Nolan said the old name had been accurate for what it was, and the new name was accurate for what it was now. Cole filed the paperwork the following Monday. The original container office stayed exactly as it had been. Other people had moved into newer spaces. Nolan ran the software and data side from a dedicated room in the newly built operations center at the east end of the lot. But Cole kept his desk in the container, where he had always kept it, with the padlock on the nail and the operational monitors on the wall and the maintenance logs in the same folder system he had used since year 2. He had been offered better arrangements more than once. He had stayed. Claire Vaughn joined the operation not as an owner, but as a strategic partner, a formal arrangement in which Vaughn Industrial Group provided connection to major freight networks, while Cole's operation handled flexible, modular logistics that Vaughn's traditional infrastructure could not accommodate. The arrangement was structured so that Cole retained full operational control and majority ownership. Claire had agreed to those terms without extended negotiation, which told Cole something about what the previous 6 years had changed in her understanding of value. Naomi Pierce's final piece in the series ran under the headline, "The $100 Yard That Rebuilt A Town." It appeared in the Regional Business Journal was picked up by 3 national trade publications in the logistics and commercial real estate sectors and generated, over the following 2 weeks, inquiries from operators in 4 other states asking whether the Mercer model was replicable and whether Cole would consider consulting on new sites. He held those inquiries. He was not opposed to the idea. He was, at the moment, busy. Warren Hale came by the yard one afternoon in early fall, unannounced, the same way he had asked Cole his careful question in the auction parking lot 6 years before. He stood at the gate and looked at what had become of the property he had processed paperwork for. Rows of containers repainted in clean, consistent colors, organized by zone and function, light coming from inside each occupied unit, the lanes between them wide and clearly marked and moving with the controlled rhythm of a place that understood its own purpose. Warren said he had driven past the yard perhaps a dozen times over the years and watched it change. He said he had not quite understood, on that first auction afternoon, what Cole had seen when he looked at those containers. Cole said he wasn't entirely sure he had understood it himself at the time. He had just known it was worth looking at differently. The padlock moved from the nail in the container office to the wall of the new operations center meeting room when the building was completed, mounted in a small frame that Nolan had made from a piece of the original container flooring. No plaque, no label. The people who worked there knew what it was, and the people who came for meetings and asked about it were told the story, and that was sufficient. On the evening of the formal opening of Mercer Modular Logistics, the gathering was small and held on-site, food catered by Ruth, whose business now operated from 3 containers in the cold section and had grown into a regional wholesale operation. Cole stood at the front gate as the sun went down. The containers around him were lit from inside, soft rectangles of yellow and white light, arranged in grids that stretched back through the property in every direction. The trucks that had been moving through the yard all day had quieted, and the lanes were still, and the whole structure of the thing Cole had built from $100 auction bid and a crumpled piece of carbon paper stood before him in the last of the evening light, alive in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what happens when a person refuses, for long enough and with enough conviction, to accept that something others have abandoned has no remaining value. Claire walked up beside him and stood there for a moment, looking at the sign above the gate. Then she said, with the directness that had always been her most honest quality, "6 years ago I thought you bought garbage." Cole looked at the lights, at the containers sounding their low metallic tones in the evening wind, at the place that had started as a rusted padlock in the mud and a sketch on the back of an auction receipt. He said, "No, I bought space for people to build." The lights stayed on. The yard was quiet and full and entirely, unmistakably alive.